Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President's budget message to Congress states, and I quote, "Critically, my budget would also keep our nation on a sound fiscal course," end quote. But that's just flat out false. Our nation is not on a sound fiscal course. It hasn't been for quite some time. But after reviewing this budget request, it's clear to me that the President's budget would worsen our nation's fiscal health. The Biden budget proposes $72.7 trillion of total spending and $58.3 trillion of total revenue over the next 10 years. That results in $14.4 trillion of total deficits. Publicly held debt balloons in this budget from over $23 trillion currently to $40 trillion by 2032. And that assumes no recession, no unforeseen emergency spendings like the trillions in COVID relief from 2020. If you want to really gauge whether this budget actually restores fiscal sanity, we ought to compare it to current law, at least for a starting point. Specifically, the CBO's July 21 budget baseline is a good place to start. Let's look at total deficits from a comparable time period, 22 to 23, in the Biden budget versus what is projected under current law. So under current law, CBO says that the cumulative deficit over this period of time will be $12.1 trillion. The Biden budget calls for $14.1 trillion. So how does making the 10-year budget deficit window worse by $2 trillion, despite huge tax increases, how does that put us on a stable or sustainable path? President Biden's boastful claim about reducing the 21 and 22 deficits compared to 2020 is completely disingenuous and totally context-free. In 2020, Congress passed 5 bills to respond to the public health and economic crisis posed by COVID. The unprecedented emergency spending of those bills resulted in $3.1 trillion of budget deficit for 2020 alone. Of course, it's important to remember that money was intended to be spent in 2020. Then the Democrats come along and pass the bill in March 21, full of partisan policy priorities, almost completely unrelated to COVID, and they add $2 trillion to our deficits at a time when there was no economic justification, no need for that massive spending. And now our Democratic colleagues brag about the 21 deficit being lower than 2020, but completely omit that their partisan bill actually made the 21 deficit $1.2 trillion worse than it otherwise would have been, and that bill has subsequently proven to be a significant contributor to the 40-year high inflation that our country is experiencing. The decline from 2020's record high deficit should be attributed to the expiration of the extraordinary, unprecedented spending that was in response to COVID. And there are plenty of other reasons to reject the claim that this budget is somehow fiscally responsible. It calls for a 14% year-over-year increase in non-defense. This big, massive increase in the federal bureaucracy and the welfare state, well beyond even current inflation. Meanwhile, the budget calls for an inflation-adjusted cut to our defense budget. The budget calls for only a 4% nominal increase in spending, which is an unrealistic and dangerous level considering inflation running much higher than that and a very dangerous situation around the world that we're reminded of continuously. It also, of course, proposes nothing at all to address the looming insolvency and the generally unsustainable growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which now account for 50% of total spending. Also hides the true cost, yet again, of the various tax and spend proposals featured in the so-called Build Back Better plan, some version of which is still contemplated by the administration. So, Director Young, let me ask you a couple of questions about tax hikes, because there's a lot of tax hikes proposed in this bill. Do you know what percentage of the country's total income the top 1% of wage earners earn, approximately?
Senator, we know that, for example...
I got almost no time. Do you know the answer to that question? It's a very specific question.
I think the specific thing we'd like to highlight is that 400 of the richest people in this country are worth more than $150 million.
Okay. I know you've got lots of talking points, but I did ask a specific question. Since you refused to answer it, I'll answer it. The top 1% of wage earners earn about 20% of all the earned income in America. You know what percentage of the total federal income tax burden that those same people pay?
we know what percentage of their income they pay, and it's
So
less
the answer
than
is
half of
40.
regular
So the
people.
answer is 40%. So the top 1% make about 20% of all the income, pay about 40% of all the taxes, and you and the president's budget say that that's not their fair share. Their fair share must be much higher. So, Mr. Chairman, my point in this is I'm quite sure that we won't hear what the fair share would be if paying twice the proportion of the income earned isn't a fair share. And it makes middle-class Americans wonder just what kind of tax increase you're going to hit them with to make them pay their so-called fair share.
I would just remind Senator Toomey that most of the billionaires in this country do not earn wages. They make their money elsewhere. Senator Warner.